What's up guys, and in today's video we're going to be going through why my strategy is to build for clarity over speed. And in this video we're going to be diving deep into just focusing deeply on clarity and how that shapes the vision of Killer Chaos OS. So like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models and how I'm scaling those mental models into the future. Also just to solve what hurts, basically to come into businesses and organizations and be the chief problem solver and ultimately just build back-end infrastructure while we're at it. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people that are aligned with the vision of what it is that we're actively building to solve for, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So this is going to be a super fun one. I'm super excited to just dive deep why, sometimes often you need to just focus on clarity over speed. And this is just some of the things that, I've learned personally along my journey that, have shaped the vision of Killer Chaos OS. And I know that into the future, it's only just going to bring that level of clarity and awareness that is going to allow us to, prioritize clarity in certain situations over speed. And most people are optimizing for speed, at least that I've seen it in my instance. More content, more calls, more features, basically just adding more to the tool stack, and not just making sure that, hey, or speed without clarity is just noise with a tight deadline. Basically understanding that, hey, in as much as you can have speed, you can have all these things going on, we need to make sure that, without clarity, we're just building through noise. But ultimately building and bridging that clarity, we can ultimately just make sure that we're having that sense of awareness that ultimately, brings that focus. And through that, I've learned it the hard way of saying, hey, movement isn't progress. I've had times personally along my journey when I thought that, just because I was moving, I thought that was progress. But, just building, you sometimes, lose track, and then you say, hey, like, I'm building and I'm making progress, but in real sense, you're not actually making the amount of progress that you normally would. And that's saying, hey, progress isn't always forward. Sometimes you have to take a step back and ultimately just have that outlook of saying, hey, this is what's going on and this is what progress looks like. And it's not always, just in the shape of just moving forward each and every single day, but rather, progress can be in many shapes or forms. But ultimately just understanding that and just having that level of clarity opened the doors for me in so many ways that I wouldn't have deemed possible. And with that, the trap comes here where you say, hey, fast does not equal focused at all, at least from what I've learned. That, hey, you can build an entire machine that feels busy, but if you zoom out, you realize these things, which are you're stacking without direction. Basically, you're just building on top of different tool stack, but you ultimately don't have that direction, and that direction solely just comes from having that level of clarity. And that clarity simply, you could just ask, specific questions that ultimately allow you to then understand that, hey, this is what we're actively building for. Who are we actively building for as well? And not just, just moving with speed and without that clarity, which are also super important to think about. Because I think, in as much as, like for me personally, I'm always in that build mode. I think just asking questions and also just getting that level of clarity to bridge so that we ultimately have direction is one of the modes that ultimately allows us to scale to the next level. And I personally do believe this. I've seen it in many multiple cases where just not having clarity has cost us and has been a detriment to what it is that we were building at the time. And also saying, hey, you're scaling complexity but not value. Basically saying, hey, you're coming through but you're not, you're adding more complexity but the value is not increasing. And that's where you say, hey, we're increasing complexity, this machine is becoming more and more complex, but what about the intrinsic value? What about the actual value that you're actively producing? Is it increasing or is it just staying stagnant? And then ultimately understanding that, hey, through clarity you can ultimately, just increase, although you may increase complexity, you may also increase, the value outputted. And that value outputted is one of the most important metrics, or things that you need to have as an overarching goal, to say, hey, we want to make sure that we're actively just, improving the value output. And through that, if it gets more complex, it gets more complex, but ultimately you're actively, providing more value with direction, and that direction comes through clarity and not just, go, go, go. At least from what I've seen in my case, I think one of, the most important breakthroughs, especially for me, has come through when I've, just literally just taken a step back and just solely just understood that, hey, this is what we're doing, this is what we're building, and this is, the outlook that we want to have, or the vision for the future. And with that, you start burning out, but you ultimately aren't just breaking through. And you get into that mindset of saying, hey, everything is moving so fast, it feels like we're making progress, but in as much as all of that is happening, the clarity is not there and the direction is not there, because that clarity was not gained, and the value output is not even increasing. So then you end up in a position where you're like, hey, we're doing all these things but nothing is moving, because you're ultimately just moving fast, but you don't have that level of clarity that ultimately allows you to then take the leap of faith that gets you to the next level. At least that's what I found, along my journey, just ultimately understanding that, hey, moving fast and just moving fast in every single aspect does not mean that we're solely just focused, and just ultimately just saying, hey, even though we may be moving fast, let's ask the questions that bring that level of clarity and focus, so that we have direction in what it is that we're doing at that specific time. But through that, all of that comes through, comes from a lack of clarity, ultimately understanding that, hey, you're stacking without direction, you're scaling complexity but not the value, and you're burning out but not breaking through. That all just comes from a lack of clarity. And how do you basically bridge this clarity? I like to think, hey, you bridge it by simply just asking better questions and more meaningful questions that ultimately bridge and get you to the ROI that you're actively looking for. And by solely just saying, hey, we want to actively just think about, the problems that we're solving and scaling for in this XYZ manner, and ultimately just asking those questions, and those questions bring a level of awareness that, ultimately bring that focus and clarity, I think is the way to bridge that. And that's why I've rewired my thinking and saying, hey, instead of asking how fast can I do this, I rather now ask, why does this matter, who is this for, and what does winning look like? Basically having that overarching goal, because that overarching goal allows you to then, put the pieces together that formulates all the things that, all the actionable steps as well, that you need to take in order to reach that overarching goal. But you wouldn't know that if you just don't ask the right questions. At least I found, instead of asking, hey, how fast can I possibly move, rather asking, hey, why does this matter, and who is it for, and also what does winning look like? Because speed is a tool, but clarity is the compass. Without that compass, you just simply do not have that direction that ultimately gets you there, and speed is the tool that aids, that compass or that direction that gets you there. But ultimately using them hand in hand is one of the things that, you ultimately, can use to your benefit, rather than it, causing harm for you in the long term. And that's why, the tactical changes that I'm personally making now, which is weekly reflection prompts inside Notion. What am I doing out of habit versus intention? Basically focusing on what are the habit traits that I have versus the intentions, or the actionable intentions that I'm actively doing on a day-to-day basis. Am I being intentional with what it is that I'm building on a day-to-day basis? And if so, what am I actively doing what am I actively doing in order to log that? So basically just logging that and making sure that, hey, I have this Notion board and I'm actively logging in, the habits that I have versus the intentional steps that I'm actively making, and just using that as, a source of truth to basically base my decision trees that I'll be making into the future off of. And then rewriting core system descriptions inside Killer Chaos OS to say, hey, if I can't explain it simply, it's not ready to scale. If I can't explain it within a few sentences that is simple enough for someone else to understand, then I simply is not ready for scale. And that's okay, but ultimately saying, hey, it needs to be simple to describe and someone needs to get it in 90 seconds or less, which is one of our internal, things that, I like to speak to with the team, to say, hey, if you don't understand this within 90 seconds or less, then we need to understand that, hey, clarity is not formed, because if you can't understand it, you ultimately don't know what you're building for. And then saying, hey, slowing down hiring and outreach to tighten the back end before volume, saying, hey, in as much as we can actively just build these different modes and different things, we need to actively just make sure that we're slowing down our process and just hiring slow, and just taking the time that we need to ultimately just tighten up the back end so that when the volume hits, when we are running 200, 300, different clients and things like that, we actively just, are able to cater for that volume and not just, pumping out fast and then the system breaks, but gaining that level of clarity of what it is that we need to do in that present moment in time and then scaling it from there. And why all of this matters is essentially the clearest minds build the best systems. This is just my personal belief that in as much as we need to build these systems, the only way that we're going to be able to, do it in the best way that, maximizes our ROI for our clients is ultimately by having sound minds, having a clear vision and also just clear minds that ultimately build the system, because you don't want to have foggy minds that are actively, the mind scattered in different places, but rather, hey, how can we formulate a clear mind that ultimately allows us to then, build the systems, build the modes that we need to, and ultimately scale our operations in the manner that, yields the ROI for the business. And also making sure that, hey, the most dangerous builders aren't always the fastest. They're the ones who see through the noise. Ultimately understanding that, in as much as there's so many things going on, we need to make sure that we are also able to take a step back and, just have this overview that allows us to tune out the noise and actually focus on what actually matters. And through asking those questions, and also asking first principles based questions and using that mental model or framework, I think we can get to the source of truth that ultimately allows us to reason up from there. And that is why I want to operate with surgical precision, because I don't want to, just hustle with the scatter shot hustle, but rather just, hey, how can I, have surgical precision? How can I be the doctor in the operating room and just being super dialed in and locked in what it is that we're actively doing on a day-to-day basis? But in order to do that, we need to have a sound mind and we need to have sharp precision in what it is that we're doing. And then saying, hey, how I'm thinking is clarity before complexity. Do we have clarity before we build this complex machine? If so, let's do it. And then saying, hey, reflections before reaction. How can we actively reflect and see, hey, this is what we need to do, this is what we need to do, this is what we have done in the past, and then actively just doing it before we react. And also simplicity is a power play, saying, hey, in as much as we can do all these complex things, how can we break it down to be as simple as possible so that we can understand it, and from understanding it, we have our source of truth that we actively just build from, which ultimately means that, hey, fast gets attention, clear wins get long term. I'm building Killer Chaos OS not just as a tool, but as a lens of reality for founders drowning in noise. And because if you can't think clearly, you'll never build something that works clearly. Ultimately saying, hey, in as much as we need to build what it is that we're actively building, we need to make sure that we have sound minds, we have clear minds and clear vision as well, in order to understand what it is that we're actively building, and also making sure that, hey, we can break this down to make it as simple as we possibly can, and making sure that, hey, that clarity is formed before we just move with speed or with intent, and that we're moving with intention as well, because that's also super important. How can we actively just move with speed and precision, with surgical precision in what it is that we're actively building on a day-to-day basis? And through this, I know that we're just gonna ultimately redefine and shape industries, the ultimate vision for Killer Chaos OS, and we're just gonna take one step closer that is ultimately gonna get us there. But in order to do that, we need to take one step at a time and just keep pushing the needle forward and just moving each and every single day in the direction that we need to move with surgical precision. But yeah, this has been a super fun video. I will do a part 2 sometime in the future. I think just that level of clarity is ultimately gonna build the vision of Killer Chaos OS and what it is that we're actively gonna be doing into the future. So I'm gonna be just super dialed in terms of building for clarity over for speed. In as much as we can build things fast and we can ship things fast, I think having that level of clarity before is ultimately going to be what defines how we're going to be moving into the future. But I think in the future we're going to fail so many times. We could be wrong about certain things, and that's okay. It's just then becomes a question of how can we build better mental models and frameworks, and also just learn from those mistakes so that we can ultimately build the vision of Killer Chaos OS. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're just building and building with clarity and intention and surgical precision for the future. And with that, if you guys have any questions, just make sure to pop me just make sure to pop a comment, and also just follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn, X, and I will see you guys in the next video.